Good evening. My name is Juliane Camfield. I'm the director at Deutsches Haus at NYU. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our event about Kafka's Diaries and the new translation into English of Kafka's Diaries by Ross Benjamin, who sits in the middle of the distinguished group of three. Ross worked on this translation, or should I say labored on this translation for the biblical accomplishment of 8 years or so. When we just discussed it when we had Festival Neue Literatur a long time ago, he was already working on this. And thank you so much for not giving up and for giving us this beautiful gift. And thank you, Uli, and thank you, Vivian, for being here to discuss this new translation and to discuss what we see in this new translation and to discuss why this new translation matters with Ross and Uli and Vivian. And we decided we will no longer read pages long biographical information. We've made that executive decision, but you shall not be deprived of the accomplishments of these distinguished speakers, because we put them very much in the COVID mood, since that's when we got the smartboard on our smartboard. And so you can read about their bio on the smartboard, and it's rotating. Other things I should mention: we are taping this event. If you do not want to be taped or photographed, now is the time to leave, right? Just the three of you, please don't do that. And we asked them beforehand. So we will tape this, and we will make it available, the tape part of what we're doing, on our Deutsches Haus at NYU YouTube channel. And John is our photographer, and we will post the pictures of this event on Facebook in a couple of days. So if you want to share this, you can share it with friends and tell friends that we will have this for the afterlife on our YouTube channel. All right. Thank you, Ross, for the translation. Thank you for you coming here. Everybody I know New York has a lot to offer, so we appreciate your interest in our events. And of course, we expected that people would be very curious about Kafka, because people tend to be curious and enthralled with Kafka. And we will discuss perhaps also why this is still the case, or more even than it used to be, and what it all means to be interested in Kafka this day and age. Some more thanks go to the wonderful people at Random House, Penguin Random House, I should say, Demetri and Vanessa, who were instrumental in making this happen, and who also sent us some copies of the book. So if you haven't got the book yet, you can acquire it outside for $40 in cash after the event. And maybe Ross would be prepared to do a little drawing or write his name as an autograph. And this is what the book looks like. And I love the cover. Perhaps we can also talk about the cover, because that is another translation process, only the translation is by the visual artist Peter Mendelssohn. And you might know his work from his illustrations of like pretty much all the other Kafka books that are out there. And if you haven't noticed, and I showed this to my daughter, and she said, "Oh, it's an I, and it's the letter I." And anyway, just some food for thought. All right, thanks also to the DAAD, the German Academic Exchange Service, for their support of our academically inclined events. We couldn't do it without them, and we are eternally grateful for their support. And before I just say a few words about Kafka's Diaries, let me just say we have a really exciting event coming up on February 23rd. About White Side, White Face with Nick Merzoff and Candice Brights and Zoe Samutzi. If you have time, that's going to be virtual on February 23rd. And now we're almost there, and I'm not going to read any bio info. I'm just going to say a few words about this book. Dating from 1909 to 1923, the handwritten diaries contain various kinds of writing: accounts of daily events, reflections, observations, literary sketches, drafts of letters, accounts of dreams, as well as finished stories. This new translation makes available for the first time in English a comprehensive reconstruction of the diary entries and provides substantial new content, including details, names, literary works, and passages that were omitted from previous publications. By faithfully reproducing the diary's distinctive and often surprisingly unpolished writing in Kafka's notebooks, and I think there were 12?
And some bundles of loose papers.
Great. Ross Benjamin brings to light not only the author's use of the diaries for literary experimentation and private self-expression, but also their value as a work of art in themselves. And now comes a question for you. Who in the audience has read Kafka's diaries in German in the past? Okay. Wow, okay. And who has read the previous edition in English of Kafka's diaries? Okay. And who has read Ross's new translation? Which you would be a fast reader if you had. So, all right, good. Thank you for sharing this with us. Our speakers will speak around 45 minutes, and then there will be room for questions and perhaps answers, we'll see, but some kind of response. And then afterwards, we'll have a little wine reception. And it would be fabulous if you could help by moving chairs a little bit to the side so that not everybody gets completely squished in the lobby. And very last but not least, thank you so much to Sarah for working behind the scenes, and also to Julia, our new colleague who's helping with everything, and Jack and Cameron. And if I forgot anything else, then I can't help. But so please join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers, Ross, Uli, and Vivian. Thank you so much.
Good evening. Is this working? Yes. So good evening. Thank you so much for coming tonight. And thank you to Deutsches Haus and Juliane and the staff for inviting us tonight. It's very moving to sit here with new and old friends to talk about Kafka's diaries, and we are celebrating the publication of your amazing translation as an event in itself, that this book actually constitutes a book worth reading, not as a supplement to what people think they know about Kafka, but as a book in itself. And I also want to acknowledge that I've known Vivian for, I think, about 23 years, and through my late teacher, Jeffrey Hartman, who introduced us when we went to a conference in Antwerp together. So it's always wonderful to see you again. We've talked about Kafka over 23 years now, probably. And I met Ross, actually, at my friend Daniel Kehlmann's for dinner, who was a writer in residence and a teacher in the German department here for many years, who actually, I think, just wrote the script for a TV series about Kafka for German television. So there's many connections of people. The connection, which is also not a connection that my late teacher, Jeffrey Hartman, had grown up in Germany, but then survived in England and spoke English with me, and Kafka's language was something we discussed many times of what kind of German is this and who owns this language. I'll start with one quote here, and then I'll move right along. I will ask Ross what motivated you to do this translation. The quote is from December 16th, 1910, and Kafka writes, "I will no longer abandon the diary. Here I must hold on, for only here can I. I would like to explain the feeling of happiness that I have within me from time to time, as I do right now. It's really something effervescent that fills me completely with a slight pleasant tremor, and that persuades me of abilities of whose non-existence I can convince myself with absolute certainty at any moment, even now." So Kafka goes to the height of effervescent, a feeling of happiness, a tremor, slightly pleasant, that then he undoes entirely by saying, I can convince myself I have none of the abilities required to write this diary. This is a very beautiful Kafkan sentence, which leads you all the way up to perfect happiness and then undoes it. But the beauty in it is that he undoes it himself. It's not undone from outside of this text. So maybe I'll start, Ross, and then we'll get Vivian to comment. And we've already spent the afternoon talking about some moments where Kafka reflects on this practice of keeping a diary that was not meant for publication, but has an incredibly important role to play in his life and is in his self-understanding as a writer. So maybe you can start us out by saying, how did you fall into this beautiful mess of a book that is now available for the first time in English.
Yeah, well, I had myself first read the old English translation when I was in my adolescence. I became enthralled with Kafka. We keep saying enthralled, but maybe that's the right word. Under his spell, right? I'd read The Trial and the stories in the old Muir translations, in the old Schocken books editions, which this is now published by that same publisher. And I'd quickly moved on, or not moved on, but moved into the diaries and letters as this particularly rich and revealing trove of Kafka's writing, that was published posthumously, like much of his most famous writing, including the 3 unfinished novels that we know as The Trial, The Castle in America. And in that, this was before I knew German, and in that English edition, I think a lot of what I discovered later that drove me to translate the diaries was hinted at, but not fully there. In retrospect, at the time, I didn't sense something was missing necessarily, but I was very intrigued by this diary writing. I remember, 16 years old, keeping diaries and imitating the voice, which I think many literary diarists have done in their own diaries, mimicked Kafka's voice in that former English translation or in that former edition. But when I did learn German, partially in order to be able to read Kafka in the original, after spending some time in Prague, also, in part in search of Kafka, and I found that there were new editions of the diaries that had been published in German in 1990. So it's a whole saga of publication that's a little complex, hard to sum up in few words, but the edition that I had read as a teenager had come out in 1948 and 49 in English and in German fairly simultaneously. Actually, the English translation came out shortly before the German publication. And the way they came into existence was Kafka's literary executor, who was put in charge of all his papers and whose charge was, in fact, to burn his papers. Kafka had left a letter asking his friend Max Brod to burn everything that had not been published in his lifetime. Brod collected it and proceeded to publish it, beginning with those novels that hurtled Kafka to worldwide fame. And then later started to publish these so-called autobiographical writings, letters, diaries, in editions that he created. So he took these Kafka's notebooks, which he had in a vault, in which he had rescued, they were at risk from the Nazis by the time Brod had fled with them to Palestine. And he took them out of the vault, transcribed them into typescripts, and then proceeded to craft his own edition, leaving things out, making composites of. Kafka wrote a lot of drafts of literary pieces in the diaries, and sometimes he would write dozens of drafts of the same piece, and Brod would sort of piece them together into a composite and discard a lot of what didn't fit, and fragments, and all kind of this mess that you're talking about. He tidied it up, and he left out certain things that maybe he judged unflattering to Kafka, or at the time that would have been salacious, maybe by his own judgment, particularly lewd sexual stuff or stuff that he deemed lewd, homoerotic stuff, passages like that that he cut, and passages that were simply unflattering to people who might have still been alive at the time, or to Kafka himself, or to Brod himself. And so what we had, and what I had read as a teenager, was a significantly abridged and rearranged and refashioned version of the text. When I discovered in German, what I discovered in German when I finally could read German had come out in 1990, a new edition where they went back to the notebooks, transcribed them without making many heavy editorial interventions. They put it into the literary form of linear form of a book. So, Kafka might flip the notebook over and start from the back, and so there were some minor structural decisions made, but mostly they tried to have a hands-off approach to putting it in German, and I discovered that beautiful mess that you mentioned in my reading, and then just kind of waited for it to appear in English translation. I discovered it, it had already been there for 15 years by the time I discovered it, and 10 years later I translated a few books myself, and still nobody had undertaken this. Maybe after 8 years of agonizing over it, I know why. But yeah, it just seemed to be this it seemed to be something that needed to be remedied. Something this Kafka that the German-speaking world knew now from these unfiltered or less filtered diaries was a Kafka that the English-speaking world hadn't yet gotten to know. And out of that urge that we may all have to share, a TV show we've seen that maybe our friend hasn't seen, or something we've read that our friend hasn't read, I had this urge to share this experience of reading this version of Kafka's diaries, and that led me down the path.
So maybe we can say, because the editorial story is quite interesting and a bit complicated, that Max Brod published these books. He had rescued all these manuscripts that Kafka, most of them Kafka hadn't want to be published, but Kafka read from these diaries many times to his friends and said, I'm looking for something in the diaries to read to my friends tonight, to read to his sister. So we know he shared a lot of this with other people. So it's not a secret diary. But what you've done is, Max Brod did something, he presented a Kafka to the world, and now there's a different Kafka, so you either extended that or you revised some of it. And I think we sort of agreed, we wanted to go into the book itself, actually, and see what is happening in this book. And there's a very fascinating story around the editorial process that, if you are kind of an academic nerd like us, you'd love these stories. They're also really thrilling. There's also a lot of politics involved and the relationship between Israel and Germany, all sorts of things, and who owns these things and money and all that. But maybe we'll get back to you in a second, and Vivian, you can sort of take us into the book for a moment, and we'll come back out. And I want to hear ultimately, Ross, what your experience as a 16-year-old, what has changed now that you've read all of this for 8 years, and what actually moves you in Kafka today that probably something different that moved you when you were 16. But maybe Vivian will go to you, and you can take us into the text a little bit. And I'll give you a microphone.
Thank you. Did it work? Hello. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you for flying over here.
It's really a big pleasure, especially talking about this new translation, this new version. I think that you're really giving a big present to not only to readers of Kafka, not only to aficionados of diaries, but to the literary world also because of the controversies that this raises. It raises many questions, and the wonderful reviews that you got, and also some critical ones, certainly add to this. So I think that the literary world does indeed live partly of such controversies, and these reach really to the heart of things. And I think it is not an accident that this happens with Kafka's diaries. They raise fundamental issues such as what is the relationship between the life and the work? What is the role of the reader with diaries? Isn't there a kind of voyeurism? What is the responsibility of the translator, of the editor? So I think that behind the editorial story as such, there are larger questions. And Kafka is, he's been called everyone's darling. He has been especially the philosopher's darling. And the question, maybe one can put the question, since we're close to Valentine, in how do you love your darling? So one version would be the way Brod did. He wanted to protect his darling from any kind of potential critique of not being, up to the great figure that one used to expect authors to be. And on the other hand, there are some who love him so that they want to know the nitty-gritty of their, not only their lives, but even their inner lives. And that is where, we get to the kind of difference between your version and Broad's version, but also the difference between different reactions to your book that I found quite fascinating, and that for all passionate readers, not just academic nerds, there is this question as to how much do you really, want to know about an author. And there is, so I picked out two reviews because I found that they both raise such core questions. And maybe from there they lead us to, what we want, what we expect of a book like that. Why would we read a diary like that? And what can Kafka's diary, how can it speak us? How can it address us today? So the one review that I found wonderful, at the same time as raising questions, is Cynthia Ozick's that I found on your website, that has some extraordinary remarks about your book. So this is Ozick. This new and scrupulously faithful translation of the diaries brings us, unembellished by theory, the true inner life of the 20th century's most complex and enigmatic literary prophet, whose very name has come to us as symbol and vision of innocent vulnerability in the face of irrational force. So, as a close reader, I was trained on reading poetry closely, and I could not get rid of this habit. So for me, even something that sounds like a blurb for a book.
It is a blurb, yeah.
Okay, it is.
It was
the
a blurb, yeah,
okay,
yeah.
I didn't get the book. I only
Right.
got the PDF, so
No,
I
that-
didn't see the
yeah.
blurb. It sounds like a blurb.
Yeah.
But for me, I start thinking, what are the kind of values of literary, of expectations, if you bring in that kind of, just a vocabulary, innocent vulnerability, what would Kafka have thought about being called, innocent, especially in a book where you just use the word lewd. So what do we do with this innocent vulnerability in the face of irrational forces, why would these forces be irrational? It is interesting, but then primarily the last sentence, the last bit of this blurb, is it also on the...
Yeah.
Okay. Yet warns. So it suggests that your book warns.
Uh-huh.
Beware interpretation.
Or his name, right? Whose very name warns. Yeah. His name comes to us as symbol and vision of innocent vulnerability, yet warns, beware interpretation. So maybe it's his name that warns?
This is really, you mean, okay, in any case, beware interpretation, I was very intrigued what would bring, an echo of Susan Sontag's against interpretation into especially into the Kafka world, where interpretation has become so much part of it, where it begs interpretation. So what exactly is this gesture? I found that interesting and your book has brought such questions about, but most intrigued I was by really critical, and I asked Ross for permission if I can bring this up, a really critical interpretation, review of his, of this diary, of this new version of the diary. It is by Marco Roth in the tablet, and I think you should really be delighted about this because it brings out, I think it brings out its antithesis, and you start want to, repudiate this. It is a critique that says that Ross killed his Kafka. I'm exaggerating only a little bit, but he had this Kafka myth, and now knowing all these details and all these, everything you mentioned before, sexual, homoerotic, some nasty remarks about people. He says it has made Kafka a smaller man. But so here again, you see the values behind this. He expects Kafka
You have a prophet in the Aussic, so he's a prophet.
Exactly.
Who doesn't get interpretation. No prophet has ever given us anything we wanted or knew, so prophecy is the art of interpretation. And then you have this review saying you made him into a smaller man. First of all, you did not write this book. All right. Yeah. So in some ways, I mean, you think you did. It's written on your body, but you did not write this book.
I don't think he singled me out. I think he said in this edition.
But let's stay with this. What does he mean?
So I'm quoting. For some, so Roth feels that you have destroyed his Kafka by, quote, deliberately translating fragments, however truncated, cryptic, or seemingly marginal.
He's quoting me from the diaries.
Right. And then he says, now this is neither a work of scholarship nor of literature, but, and this is where the term you have already mentioned came from, a massive mess. So we are in the presence of a massive mess. Now, Roth, and I have to add this, calls you also a wonderful...
I remember the exact words.
Go ahead.
He calls me a heroic and gifted translator.
Heroic and gifted, okay.
So I really shouldn't fetch about his review if he,
No, but he says, and he even adds, the mess is partly by design. Yeah. Now, it's interesting that by translating Kafka as close as possible to Kafka, it is your design to have created the mess, which I also found interesting. Now, I think that this design has its raison d'être, even if it is strange that it should be a design. You know, what exactly, Cynthia Ossick says there's no theory, unembellished by theory. Mm-hmm. Now there is quite a lot of theory implied in believing that you ought to have the original, the authentic Kafka there. And I wanted to ask you about that. But there is a contradiction in this, a very interesting contradiction in this review, because what he's saying, Marco Roth, is saying that that Kafka thereby comes back into domesticated view. So this has domesticated. I don't know how Roth gets to associate domesticity with mess, but what he means is that this grand man that he had in his, with his mythical Kafka, is now a small man that lives in a small house. Well, I would say that there's probably the exact opposite going on, even if we take the idea of a mess. I think one has to see that which Roth criticizes as having made Kafka smaller. Things like his brothel visits, his nasty remarks about his family, nasty remarks about Jews, nasty remarks about, his very best friend, Max Brod, for example. I think that one has to see this in tension with something else that is there in the diaries as well. One of the famous sentences that could be equally misleading, and that is when Kafka says, when Kafka formulates his desire in a diary entry to raise the world into the pure, true, and immutable. Mm-hmm. So I think that if we have this on the one hand, we can very well have remarks about his bowel movements and his brothel visits on the eve of Yom Kippur, and many other details. And I think that it is precisely in this tension that we are introduced to how Kafka, with this rather small oeuvre, has really captured the human in its possibilities and mainly its impossibilities. Because, of course, to raise the world into that is an impossibility. And this is where we come to the diaries themselves and what they try to do. Because Kafka wants, in a way, to observe closely everything, including himself. And this is, so I was asked to choose from my favorite quotes. And they are, I realized that some of my favorite quotes are precisely dealing with this self-observation and what that does, because I think that tells us something about the diaries. But maybe you want to...
I want to just add one thing, Vivian, because we've talked about it a bit when he says this, so we can leave these reviewers behind now, but the idea that Kafka becomes smaller, and we've talked about this, and there's a lot of diminutive small figures and things that address one. They're not even all beings or animals. We don't even know what they are. But smallness is a device, let's say. It actually has been talked about for so long. So for someone to say he made Kafka smaller, Kafka wants to be really small many times, really, really small. And to actually make it's all about scale and sort of, and you've talked about this in some of the stories that, you know, the animal characters, they actually vanish. You can't find them, you can't see them. It's not about actually positing literature as this, which gives us a story and truth, but actually it recedes in a way, opens up a space. But I kind of, this smallness, bigness seems such like, here's the prophet in one review and then there's a small man. For Kafka, that's one figure. The prophet will be this little tiny thing, you know, opening up, of course, because who's going to be the righteous? We'll not know. It will be the little mouse. You know, he gives all these names, but these are not names. These are actually just designation for something we haven't recognized before. Because we fail to overlook it, thinking, where's the prophet? Where is it coming in? When is the Messiah coming in? We think it's going to be in a gold robe. No, not for Kafka. It's a little thing, you know, a little dust bunny under the bed. So in some ways, it's all scale. And if you don't pay attention, you're going to miss the Messiah because you've overlooked the little dust, you know, the little cloud of dust under your bed. And
the messy figure.
Yes.
The messy figure, you know, Marco Ross, he says
messy is also the messianic. It's one step away from the messianic. I think that's what Mark really wanted to talk about. It's a beautiful messianic story.
You know, he says that he loved this Kafka because he this was like my life, is what he says. And this completely misses the idea of the encounter with a stranger, with somebody who unsettles you and who disturbs and who shows that this whole attempt to control and put an order into things eventually fails anyway. And this is what we experience with Kafka throughout.
Well, I had a private correspondence with Marco Roth after this, and I promised him we wouldn't make him into a straw man. Because I said, you know, it turns out that I got some, you know, really glowing reviews, and people congratulate me on them, and that's kind of the end of it. I feel great. You know, they congratulate me, and I've tried to be humble or whatever, you know, but I feel really good. I get an ego boost. But with his review, I end up in a whole long conversation with somebody about Kafka, which I think is something you were getting at. Having controversy, having disagreement actually is fuel for, and I was thinking about, and I said to in this private correspondence that, which I'm making public, my side of it, only, you know, that it's good to have kind of a foil. Like I was sort of coming up with other you know, Brode could be a foil. You know, look at what he did in sanctifying and sanitizing Kafka by diminishing his complexity or whatever. But anyway, having promised not to strawman him, I think I do have a little bit of a sense of what he's talking about with domestication, and it's a danger that sort of wouldn't be my responsibility as the translator. But he mentions at one point, he says, like, we're making Kafka into a predecessor of our autofictional vogue right now, so he's just a sort of Knausgaard or Annie Ernaux avant la lettre. He says something like that polemically. So I think what he's fearing is just a new graven image of Kafka, where we would see him as, you know, this workshopping figure or something, and that would happen maybe see, for me, it's just about making available to English-speaking readers this Kafka, however you find him. But if we find him in the state that we, where I would agree with him is I would say, well, there's a danger always of in our excitement, kind of reifying Kafka anew. Maybe this is the Baer interpretation. We make these interpretations, they're rich and exciting and generative because Kafka's constantly provoking our interpretations, but then they risk becoming reductive or narrowing, where we say, oh, he's a Jewish writer, or he's a writer whose sympathy is with the workers or something, where you can find a lot of rich material to kind of theorize about or interpret, and then you always run there. So here that's like, oh, what a free-flowing Kafka who's sort of crafting his literary persona in his diaries, but that this would be a new sort of idealized picture. I would agree with you that the best way to resist that kind of a picture is to present the text as closely as possible, or look at the text as closely as possible, which brings me back around to, the self-justification of my translation is that the text itself, to the things themselves, but the text itself is the, that has the most potential to resist this kind of anachronistic imposition of our ideals onto Kafka, is one that, reproduces as closely as possible that strangeness and messiness, and what's disconcerting in the original is often he'll break off in mid-sentence or in mid-word, and start anew from a totally different angle, and you realize how fractured the text is or how self-contradictory it is, in a way that you couldn't when it was tidied up the way it had been in the past. So I think it's by virtue of, looking at what Kafka had actually written, or translation of what Kafka had actually written, which is, once again, out of remove, it's not what he had written. So that made me think about, when you asked about the authentic issue, that it is something I purposely said in my translator's preface, that I stopped short of thinking that this project is a project of retrieving the authentic Kafka, because I think because I was worried about precisely the same thing Marco Roth is pointing to in his polemical way, for all that I disagree with his overarching interpretation. I think I had the same instinct when I added a line to my preface saying, but I'm not retrieving the authentic Kafka. This is, what if we were already taking the, contents of notebooks and transferring them into the form of a book, with uniform typescript, this kind of aura of the original is irretrievable and should be irretrievable. Like, we are always making versions and new interpretations, and so the idea of authenticity wasn't what was important to me. What was important to me was getting as close as possible to everything that I found strikingly jarring and disconcerting and strange in the original, and resisting every temptation I had, to the extent that I could, to sort of tame that strangeness.
There are also passages that we now have in English, thanks to you, that are of a different tonality, different from, really, that is what surprised me. They are not the jarring, and they are not the disturbing or the irritating or the lewd, but they are the beautiful, and I did not expect that. And maybe I can give you a little example. There is a passage omitted by Broad, probably because he felt that this was a sexual issue. But I just want to read the sentence to you, and you see what I mean. So there are two sentences that are in Broad. I was never before intimate with a woman, except in Zuckermantel, Kafka writes. Then again with the Swiss girl in Riva. The first was a woman, I ignorant. The second was a child, I utterly confused. And here's where Broad stops. And then we read on in the new translation. with F, that's Felice. I was intimate only in letters, humanly only in the past 2 days. It's certainly not so clear, doubts remain. And then this sentence, but beautiful the gaze of her soothed eyes, the opening of womanly depth. And then the next entry is, and so open yourself, gate, person, come forth, breathe the air and the stillness. Now, without the opening of womanly depth that is not there in Brot, you go straight from I utterly confused, and so open yourself, gate opens. And what we
It
are
rhymes in
missing-
German too. It's öffne dich, Tor, Mensch, komme hervor. Yeah.
Mensch komme hervor. So if, Brot thought that this was too lewd, maybe we have, thanks to your new version, we are gaining insight into a Kafka that indeed the word beauty doesn't come up too often, but this doesn't only speak about beauty. It actually contains beautiful, beautiful lines.
And we can maybe gently then correct a kind of, I think your translation has evoked some responses sort of surprise, which is natural in to say, well, Kafka had sex and Kafka had a body and all these realizations, which have been known for quite a while to some people, but apparently not to everybody. But in some ways, what you're saying, actually, he was truly touched and moved by something he couldn't quite comprehend. And it's not a salacious sort of sexual, it's erotic in the deepest sense of actually wanting to know what this experience meant for him. That is very different from the kind of lewd or salacious. He actually grappled with it. It's dignified, it's deeply moving, it is erotic, and in some ways I think where Kafka opens up to himself, and there he stays sometimes, and he says, what am I to myself here? And that's actually it's also very different, I think, from Aniano and other people. It's a very different mode, and what you're saying, he goes very far to try to understand his own responses and reactions. He's constantly puzzled by himself, but not in a sort of way of, I'm so interesting, but rather everything is so much. And here it's a very beautiful thing, and it's very rare, actually, in these diaries that you get the irrational forces pressing down on the individual. There's almost none. He said, the job is really tedious. I have to work all the time, and my dad's harassing me to work in the factory. But it's not like the institutions of the 20th century will crush alienated man. It doesn't have any of that. So in some ways, you have this moment of opening, and what does this opening onto? And so who is the Kafka who emerges here, who is there, who shows himself occasionally? He opens himself up to himself and stays there for these moments, and the only thing we have is these sentences. And I think it's quite moving, actually, to see somebody who's very serious about exploring himself, who doesn't take himself seriously. He distrusts himself constantly. And then he breaks off. He says, oh, and then I went to sleep again because I had to sleep a lot, and I'm always tired, and I don't write enough. And But this is a very beautiful moment because it's dignified, it's erotic in a deep sense and not in a salacious sense. And in some way, like Max Brod did what he did, he gave us Kafka, you're giving us another Kafka, but it's a very touching Kafka because he's been touched by something that he can't quite articulate. It happens also in other scenes when he's very close friends with actors in a Yiddish theater, very, very close friends. And he says really funny things like, I was called to my friend today. He called me out on it. I denied it. So wait, what? And he's in love with one of the actors, this woman, and it's very moving. And he goes to the theater. He goes to the theater constantly. It seems like every night he's at the theater, and he has really strong responses to it. And there sometimes he's pulled out of himself into something, into this, and he loves actors and acting because they have to lose themselves in a role, and he can't quite lose himself in his role. He's really moved in the theater every night. And even when he hates it, he says, this was a terrible performance. And then he picks out one little thing. This was incredible how she moved her leg to the left. And you're thinking, and everything else was terrible. It was a horrible production, and the costumes were wrong, and the curtain went up in the back, and you could see past the stage, and everything collapsed. But this was amazing.
Yeah, and then he'll say it's like the truth or something.
Yeah, and I'm kind of interested in these moments, which are small. They're not epiphanies. They're something because he's actually very much in control there. He's writing them. He's creating them for us.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to emphasize about those lines. Is that's the other thing he did when he went to his diaries. Is he was trying to write verse, basically, based on the experience he had. So, and that's the other aspect in which there's nothing really auto-fictional about this in that unfiltered, raw way. Like, it's raw because he didn't finish it. He didn't prepare for publication. He planned to have it burned, by the time he died, not all along. And he did actually extract pieces from the diaries and prepare them for publication and then publish them as literary pieces. So, which underlines what I want to get at here, which is that this was always a literary effort he was making in the diaries. I think almost invariably. I mean, now and then he might write like just headache or something, but much of the time, if he starts to get into an entry, he's composing and he's crossing things out and reworking things and crafting metaphors and images, for his headaches. A headache is like 2 boards screwed in at each of my temples or something. And you're like, okay, he's not just writing in his diary, I had a really bad headache today. He's creating literature. He might not get all the way there. But so they're writers' notebooks, and that's something you mentioned the question you were going to ask me about, what changed in my perception of Kafka. I think it's very easy as an adolescent to read many people like this, but maybe particularly Kafka, and maybe this goes to something Marco Roth is describing in the autobiographical parts of his piece, to read them as this really authentic figure of, the tortured artist or the alienated 20th century man or whatever, to really over-stress that sense of I'm getting this, the depths of this person's humanity or something. Whereas what's changed for me is not that those depths aren't there, that alienation isn't there, or these struggles weren't sincerely felt, but that in his diaries we see how much he was painstakingly at work in crafting these experiences and thoughts and ideas into literature and into something poetic and profound, and we get to see him doing it in that sort of looking into the writer's creative process and getting to really see him backtracking and changing things and rewriting them, and the workshop aspect of the diaries. But what we're seeing is this kind of relentless literary effort, and that's part of what I think I originally found energizing and invigorating about the diaries, and what I find even more invigorating in the edition that shows us Kafka at work in this intimate way is that really kind of fearless, considering how much suffering it seemed to put him through, fearless act of literary invention. He was always circling back to predicaments that were really agonizing for him, but then he was always doing something incredibly creative and even playful and funny with those predicaments, and reimagining them. And I don't think that necessarily consoled him, but it was what he did with his inner life all the time. And because this is a written document, we just see him doing that, transmuting everything into that.
Maybe I can give an example that relates to what the diaries are. It comes from, so I have a little collection of quotes, but I'm just going to give you one or maybe two, about, it's a collection of quotes about self-observation. And so there is one. Inescapable duty of self-observation. If I'm observed by someone else, naturally I must observe myself too. If I'm observed by no one else, I must observe myself all the more closely. So this is turning his predicament into something, something funny. And this is a predicament because one can feel in the diaries, and of course it's interesting, diaries are in a way self-observations as such, and one can feel how the self-observation can be a real hindrance, a real obstacle. I remember my German professor called it die Hypertrophie des Bewusstseins. So this hyper-consciousness in Kafka that will actually block, but Kafka finds in the diaries. So what we have here is self-observation about self-observation. But then what comes out of it is a wonderful literary moment. So he has here, what would it be like if one choked to death on oneself? If pressing self-observation made the opening through which one pours out into the world too small or completely closed it, at times I'm not far from it. And then, and I love your translation here. So about self-observation, the filth one will find there will be there for its own sake. At bottomless depths, one will find the bottomless depths will contain no lava but filth. It will be the bottommost and uppermost, and even the doubts of self-observation will soon be as weak and self-satisfied. So one will actually get something out of this self-observation, self-satisfied as the rolling of a pig in the muck. There. So you get the humor, you get the inventiveness of these metaphors, even as one wallows, literally wallows in the predicament of writing this diary and observing oneself. And I think that there is something about the diary that captures so much of that it also frees Kafka to write a fiction it goes through the self-observation and comes out being able to observe the little gestures.
Could we stay with this for a moment? And I want to go back to the pieces that were then taken out and published separately. And some of these are just stories in the middle of it. And he starts saying,
right,
absolute helplessness, took the train yesterday, my sister's getting engaged, and then it's a story for 6 pages. And you're thinking, where did this come from? But what you just said, Vivian, maybe he had to do some of this to get to some place. He remains constantly questioning whether he's really a good writer, but he has moments when he feels, oh, I wrote a great thing today. And we know from accounts when he read in 1917, he read in Munich, and he laughed the whole time. When he read to his sisters, he would always be laughing and couldn't really keep his focus because he was laughing so much. And people always have been surprised by this, but there's a lot of humor, but there was a lot of joy in his writing at moments. But the two questions is, one is, what are these pieces that became literature that we know now and they're in the collected stories or something like that? And what you just said, he had to do some of this to get to what we call literature. Although in the diaries, the distinction isn't really always visible.
Yeah, the distinction is definitely not always visible. That's the key in the diaries, is that his first collection was called Contemplation, or Betrachtung, meditation. I like contemplation because it involves looking. Betrachtung also just means looking. That's kind of a collection of prose miniatures. It's not necessarily the sorts of stories you associate with Kafka now, although some of them may be known to you. There's one called Unhappiness or Resolutions. They're known under different translations of the titles. And a number of those, there's one called A Sudden Walk. There's one called Great Noise. Great Noise, A Sudden Walk, Resolutions, The Unhappiness of the Bachelor. Those were all diary entries at one point, and it's not clear when they shifted from being diary entries to being prose pieces that were going to be published in this collection. Did he set out with the intention of writing a prose piece in his diary notebooks, which he does at times, starting with the character's name, where you know, okay, this is fiction. It says Gustav Blankelt, walked out the door and started to do the, and you know it's fiction from the very start. Or like Great Noise is a story of the noise in his apartment. It really sounds like it was a diary entry that maybe was particularly felicitous, where he just came up with some really great lines in this diary entry. This is good enough to publish. Let me just change my sister's names to initials and not change anything else. And then that's published in a literary journal and later collected in his first collection. Or A Sudden Walk 2, you suspect this really became a poetic piece, and he did change that. And it's interesting actually to look at the diary version and the published version. He changed the ending, but the whole first part of it is about what it's like when you take a sudden walk in the middle of, like, when the family's all gathered around the table, and you think maybe you're reading a diary entry, and that's what Kafka actually did, or maybe from the moment he started this, it was already a literary attempt. And those ones that are really on that line or that threshold, you know, those for me really characterize what makes the diaries so alive, is that a lot of it exists on this threshold where there's a lot of things he'd never extracted and published separately, and you may think it's a diary entry, but maybe it was already in some kind of Vorhof or like, you know,
Yeah.
a translator.
There's a wonderful example.
Threshold of literature. And then there are stories like The Judgment, where he wrote the entirety of the story in his diaries, published it later, considered it one of his greatest successes in his own, by his own account, wrote it all overnight in one sitting in what's become kind of a famous, you know, scene. Or The Stoker, he'd composed the whole thing in his diary. So longer stories, and then longer stories that he didn't finish that he wrote in his diaries. Like one, he planned to title it Memories of the Calda Railroad. It might have been collected in some editions of like unfinished, unpublished work, but it wasn't, it could have become The Judgment, but it didn't. It's a story he broke off that he began in his diaries. So these are all different categories of the literary drafts. And then there's ones where he comes back again and again and starts over. There's one that starts, "You, I said," and then goes on, and then he starts it over and over. So you get, you know, dozens of entries that all start, "You, I said," and then they go somewhere else. And then there's chunks of maybe what would be the middle of this "You, I said" story or the end of it, and they don't really all fit together. So those all are sort of interspersed throughout the diaries in a way that then casts new light on the entries that aren't obviously in one of those categories, but can't really be, you know, pigeonholed one way or the other. And I find that exciting, yeah.
There is one example of it that is maybe still another category. And I think it's my favorite Kafka moment. And it is in Gespräch mit dem Beter, conversation with the supplicant in the old translation, because I think it's not a supplicant. But anyway.
Praying man, yeah.
Praying man. But there is a moment that comes from the diaries. So in the diaries it says, my mother looks down and speaks to the neighbor and says, you know, what are you doing today? Nice weather. And she says, oh, I'm going to have a picnic in the grass. Isn't this crazy? Isn't this mad that people speak like that? And it captures the moment of the madness of normality. But it's there in the diaries and then is transformed in the literary text. It is transformed into the epitome of that kind of experience. And a whole story is built around that. And so there you can really see how something was probably a real experience, where in the diaries it's not even clear why it would have been worse than writing it down, that then becomes something that is central to Kafka's vision.
In some ways, what you just said, it doesn't quite fit in. I mean, the diaries raise this question, what's literature and what's diary? And then Kafka uses all sorts of genres or types of writing. There's paradox and parables and allegories and stories and novellas and novels, and he's all over the place in a way. He doesn't write poems. You could probably rearrange.
Except for the one you read.
You could rearrange that, and it could sound like, you know, there's a little part of it could sound like Rilke. And they're both neighbors in Prague that they're trying to met each other once at some
There is verse for just like a
so
page and a half of the diaries.
Then there are drawings in there. So the generic question is, so what we're saying, it raises a different question of who decides what is literature. And what we are kind of saying, Kafka couldn't decide. He's working out of an experience of how language becomes a way to know something about himself and about the world and how he is in the world. But it's not clear that he's saying, I'm going to write this, I'm going to write that. But he's very engaged. He writes a lot about literature. He writes about sort of Jewish literature, Yiddish, the stories. He writes about Goethe, constantly says, read too much Goethe again, can't write today. so much good.
Dickens, yeah.
Dickens. So there's a lot of actually, but and then there's not theoretical kind of explications of literature, but he's constantly engaged with that. And in some ways, what you're saying, where does language, the everyday language that we use, what you said, the absurdity of what people say in everyday speech, once you cast it in literary form, then it's not absurd, then it's literary. But we all speak in fragments and all these things. And in some ways, I think Kafka stays in that mode. We haven't touched upon, and it's probably not enough time, he writes in German as a minority-speaking community in Prague, where most people speak Czech. He speaks Czech. He learned Hebrew in Hebrew school. He writes in German, which is the literature he wants to produce in. And he speaks pretty good Czech. And actually, it's quite, he says it all the time. He says, yes, and it's quite interesting that he would be a minority writer. And if we think, where would Kafka be today? He would be living in Queens, you know, and he would be, you know, not writing in English and publishing to a community of people who will at some point receive this 100 years from now. And I would like to think Kafka would be really delighted that all of you are sitting here. He has beautiful moments when he doesn't go to the theater on time because he knows they're all waiting for him to show up. All the singers, all the soloists are singing. And then he has other moments when he's in the theater, and then he said, at some point I decided and I just walked out and silenced everyone around me. So you're thinking, he is the audience member, but he is performing his own little play for himself. So you're all still sitting here, which we appreciate. You haven't left like Kafka did occasionally in the middle of a show. And maybe we want to, if people have short comments or brief comments or questions, we'll take them in a group. You know, you can go all out and ask us specifics or be very general, and we need a mic, so...
And please speak into the mic just for the sake of the future generations so that they know what you say. So who wants to start with the first question or comment?
Well, they answered my question. Why didn't he speak? My question, you just answered it. Why didn't he write in Czech? Because that's what, he was from Prague or wherever.
Well, yeah, it was very common among sort of middle-class Jews in Prague to speak German. That Prague was, you know, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, German-speaking, multicultural empire, and the Jewish population of Prague was kind of caught between, you know, the Czech burgeoning nationalist movement, and which could at times. Well, it's very complicated. So they were kind of caught between that Czech, you know, Czech-speaking Czech nationalist movement, which was also starting to really valorize Czech literature and Czech theater and things in the Czech language, and then a multi-ethnic empire that had also emancipated the Jews quite recently from, you know, the sorts of restrictions they'd been living under for centuries. And in some ways, for many middle-class Jews, it might have seemed that the German-speaking empire was kind of a place that they could be included, and the nationalist movements were a place where there might not be a place for them because they weren't ethnically Czech or Ukrainian or Ruthenian or whatever the different ethnic designations were, which changed a lot as borders changed. And yeah, so that kind of identification of particularly, I think, middle-class more assimilated Jews like Kafka's parents, that identification with German as a language and going to the German, you know, you had a choice between the German and the Czech gymnasium or the German and the Czech sections of the university. It's sort of belonged to his cultural context in a complex way. But he had, I think, Czech governesses. I think and he spoke Czech with people at his office.
First of all, thank you so much for this very rich exchange, which I think really helps us to orbit this beautiful mess and find great little ways to get closer, perhaps. Russ, I know you're looking for something, but I have a question for you. I'm curious about your approach to translating this particular book and in how far it was similar to your approach to other works you've translated. And we know that you've translated contemporary writers. Uli mentioned, you know, like Daniel, like you've translated Till and You Should Have Left. And I'm just curious, how if your approach was different, how was it different? I mean, obviously it was an 8-year pursuit, and I mean, if you were Daniel Day-Lewis, were you Kafka for 8 years, or how did you inhabit this consciousness? How did you inhabit this language while working on other projects? You were also a curator, and how do you channel this voice, if it is channeling? Maybe it's not channeling, and I know that there are these different approaches to translating. Is it like a mystical act where you have this revelation and you really become this writer's voice in a different century?
Nice. Yeah.
Or are you more the craft-oriented person who looks up in the 20th century dictionary what Notstich means and then doesn't find anything? So that's another part, is how did you deal with the words that resisted? And that's the end of my question.
First, it was completely different from any of the contemporary things I've translated or anything else I've translated, by virtue of a lot of things, actually. But one part of it is the unique features of this text. I mean, that it's not only a writer's diaries, but it's a writer's diaries that they never prepared for publication, that were sort of rescued in the form in which they were rescued and had this complicated editorial history. And so there's a way in which it's is it nonfiction? Where would you put it in the bookstore? There's a way in which it's a document. Of course, the writer's not living, and the very particular intentions that I had going into it had to do with bringing across, and this comes to maybe the Cynthia Ozick unembellished by theory part, if this is what she meant, this is what I related to, and it is to bring across kind of what was there in the language while resisting imposing some kind of framework on it, which is not the case necessarily when I'm translating a contemporary novel, where I may have I may be very convinced of ideas I have about that novel and about how it should come across and how it should sound. And here I was always suspicious of any ideas I had about what it should sound like or how it should come across, and I wanted to somehow stay true to what I found baffling or resistant about it, which becomes a very Kafka-like challenge or impossibility, which is, I came up with this kind of motto that if something really baffled me in the original and then I translated it, but my translation didn't baffle me in the same way, then I failed to do it justice. And so you can see how it could take 8 years. There are tons of things that I went down those sorts of rabbit holes of technical decoding, research, where I thought, because sometimes you can find a context for something. I mean, that's another challenge of the diaries. You never know when something might be a very specific reference to a contextual matter that is in the background of what he's writing about, like a visit to the Yiddish theater or something, or maybe you could find it in the original play if you start decoding the Yiddish, which is something I started to do without having Yiddish, exactly. I have the Hebrew school phonetic Hebrew and the German, and, and you could go on forever and discover or decide at some point, well, maybe there is no context for this. And even if there is, sometimes I find the context, it gives me the technical term for what I want, but I realize, well, in the diaries, there's no, maybe I can add a footnote, but I can't actually translate it in a narrower way because it should have that same ambiguity as it does in the original text. So now I know what he meant, but it's not what he wrote. And I still wanted to stay true to what he wrote. And then from time to time, maybe it warranted a footnote if I really knew the context of what he meant. But a lot of times that it came back to that motto of, if this was ambiguous or multivalent and open to a whole range of interpretations in the original, even if I felt rather convinced of a more narrow interpretation, I thought it was important for the language to still be open to some kind of approximate, extent of the semantic field. So the passages, Kafka says at one point that maybe I didn't love my mother as much as I should have or could have, only because the German name Mutter doesn't apply to the Jewish mother. or can't, and that the German word kept me from loving her as well as I could or should have. And he goes on about why the word Mutter doesn't, the Jewish mother is no German Mutter, and that it contains, it's Kafka. So, at some point he says things that you have no idea what he means. He says, like, besides Christian splendor, the word also contains Christian coldness too. And it makes the Jewish mother a little odd, or he says komisch, which I translate as odd, but I had other ideas, like maybe it's comical, maybe it's funny. And then he says, and actually the Jewish father is by no means a Vater, and maybe it's only memories of the ghetto that still hold the Jewish family together at this point, because in the German language, yeah.
And he has that in the speech on Yiddish.
Mm-hmm.
Where he says that Yiddish, one can translate Yiddish into all languages except to German. It works with French, but not with German. And then he gives the examples, and they're really striking. He says, Blut und Tod, that is not Blit und Teut. Mm-hmm. And it is interesting that the sound really, that he chooses these words. And you feel like, I don't know, is Wagner speaking here, but it's Blut und Tod.
But
I always think of the word Mensch. Yeah, that's one that people know.
And it cuts into something deeper. He sort of says, I'm using a language in my daily life with my own mother that has alienated me from her, but I have no access to the Mameloschen. He does not speak Yiddish at home, never did, so it's not the language of his childhood. It's a language, though, that's vanishing. And what's also vanished, and I think that is also part, Kafka's German also vanished. So what you had to recreate, Peter Demetz was one of my teachers. He still spoke Prague German, but those people are no longer, very few of them are with us. It was a very specific way of speaking. And Kafka brings German into something, and there's a certain kind of a task Kafka is supposed to carry out, which is to keep the German language in some way readable after the Shoah and after what happened. And I was really struck that his mother's maiden name is his Hebrew name is Amshel, and Paul Celan's Hebrew name was Anshel, so they're actually close.
And that was actually their name, in Romania too. Yeah.
And Paul Celan's poetry is written after the war in German. He survives the Holocaust, his parents don't, and they're carrying a language into a space where they're already alienated from it. And Kafka is saying the German Jews are not going to survive baptism, intermarriage, and they're just assimilating into Germany. The Eastern European Jews won't survive, but it's very early, it's 1911. And what happens here, there's a German that you have to resurrect in a way that doesn't quite exist. That's already precarious then, and it's introduced a distance into his own family. But it's his language. And in some ways, I think that's what Kafka is also trying to do. I'm using language given to me that is not totally close and natural to me, so I have to make it into something. So I think when you kept all this strangeness, it's strange when people say, oh, that's not a German sentence. And I teach, among other things, German literature at NYU, and sometimes I say, you're right, it's not correct German, it's Kafka, which is a very different sentence. They say it's grammatically not right. I'm like, what does that mean for a language to have its rules, grammar, syntax, dimensions, constant, all these connotations, for someone like Kafka to use it, because he makes it alive in a new way, and in some ways. So what he's saying also, it's very complicated what he's doing with German, to give it another dimension that it doesn't have and will not have, and he knows he's working with something that's not his. But I think that also connects him to other writers. I don't believe that's very different from James Joyce or Virginia Woolf writing at the same time. They're also writing in a language not totally natural to them. Joyce writes in English, as we know. But I think you had to do something, and what's hard about a translation, you carry sort of what looks like a grammatical error into English. And people saying, wait, did Raz not proofread this book? Or is this Kafka doing it? That's very hard in a translation. The hardest moments in a translation is not really when it's not sure, but it's like, if it looks like a mistake, are you going to quietly fix that mistake? Yeah. Or are you going to leave Kafka hanging there, and then we're going to blame you always, of course.
Yes.
Never the Kafka, the prophet, but we'll say, well, you made a mistake?
Yeah, I was in constant terror, yeah.
Yeah. But the mistakes, because you actually make a point in the introduction to say, I deliberately try to get close to what Kafka is doing into this language and what is being done to him by that language.
Absolutely, yeah. But I couldn't footnote every single one of them and say, no, this was on purpose. Please keep reading.
But ultimately, the idea Kafka had of the true word is yet something else. I told Uli about it.
That's a good way to actually also bring us all together. So tell us what the true word in Kafka, what is a nice...
And it is also, I was reminded of it now because you brought in Holocaust, post-Holocaust language. And Paul Celan underlined this passage more than any other and wrote next to it, Key to Kafka. Yeah, it was quite a discovery when I saw that in Marbach.
Wait, before you go there, I will tell you one thing that I worked a lot on Paul Celan, who's a poet, and I can't hear Yiddish in German at all. I just can't hear it. I never spoke Yiddish, not a word. So I showed it to one of my teachers, Harold Bloom, and I said, and Harold said, there's my Mama Löschen until I was 7, let me see it. And he scanned it, he said, not a trace of Yiddish in this poetry right here. That you need somebody who's lived in this to hear that, actually, to see that. And it's not visible. You cannot, there's a line, it could be the word mensch and all of these words, but they're not. And then you need somebody who's lived this, but that memory is gone. It's not an academic knowledge that can be conveyed to anyone. You can't trace it.
Kafka uses it, he uses the Yiddish translation of Am Haaretz. In Yiddish, it's Am Oretz. And Am Oretz is somebody who doesn't know the law. And who is a non-learned person. And he copied I don't know if he copied, he says from the Talmud, if ein Gelehrter, a Talmid Chacham, somebody who does know, a scholar, goes out to look for a bride, he should take an Amhoretz with him, because only he knows what is necessary. I haven't found the exact quote in the Talmud, but maybe it's worth checking. But what I wanted to say about the true word and where Celan writes, and that is next to a passage in Investigations of a Dog, and the passage goes something like, the true word got lost. Actually, it wasn't even completely there at the time. Es war auf der Zunge. One almost had it. And then he defines what the true word is. And the true word is the word that can still intervene im Bau, in the building of things, that can intervene in the world. That means that can make a difference. And it is fascinating that the true word here is defined both as something magical. The true word can, you say it and it is. It's like real Sprachmagie. But it is also the political word. It is the word that can make a difference in the way the world is being organized. And there is, in the same paragraph, at the time when the true word was still the word that could make a difference, it was a time when, and in German it's, wo die Hundeschaft noch nicht so gefestigt war. Sie war noch lockerer. And Hundeschaft, it's a dog speaking, so it's basically his group, and it sounds like Hundeschaft.
The dog community.
Where the community of dogs was not so...
They hadn't closed their ranks. They were still an opening somewhere. And the community of dogs are the people who organize and manage everything.
So just the idea that if the community, the identity of the community hasn't... So closed ranks is perfect, because he said it was looser still. And there the true word could intervene and could actually make a difference. So here it's the magic of literature and the politics of literature that come together in a beautiful moment that tell us about what Kafka's true word is. And the extent to which you have been true to Kafka's true word really does make a difference. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
we're really grateful, Ross, because you've been doing a lot of things around this book. We're really grateful that you took the train here and Vivian took a plane here and has come back to NYU. You've been here many times. You can find Vivian on YouTube, Deutsches Haus events. You can see Ross on YouTube probably everywhere now. So we want to thank you for bringing this book to us and thank Deutsches Haus for hosting this event. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Uli.